Imagine this. You are a queen, the most powerful woman in England. Crowds bow when you pass. Kings write you love letters. An entire religion was changed, just so a king could marry you. And now, you are sitting in a cold stone cell, in the Tower of London, waiting to die, accused of crimes you did not commit, betrayed by people you trusted. But here is the part that history rarely tells you. The man who destroyed you was not your enemy. He was not a rival. He was not a stranger. He was your father, the same man who held you as a baby, who sent you to the finest courts in Europe, who watched you become Queen of England. That man sat on the jury that sealed your fate. He looked at the evidence. He looked at his own daughter, and he voted guilty. This is not fiction. This is not a TV show. This is exactly what happened to Anne Boleyn in 1536. And to truly understand this betrayal, you need to understand something first. Anne Boleyn was not just another queen. She was unlike any woman England had ever seen before. She was educated in the finest courts of Europe, in the Netherlands, in France. She spoke multiple languages. She had opinions, strong ones, at a time when women were expected to be silent. She challenged powerful men. She pushed back against the Catholic Church. She influenced the king himself. And she did something no woman in English history had done before. She made the most powerful man in the world wait for her for 7 years. King Henry VIII, a man who had everything, who had never been told no, pursued Anne Boleyn for 7 long years. And she refused him, not because she did not want power, but because she wanted something more. She wanted to be queen, not a mistress, not a secret, a queen. And so Henry did something extraordinary. He broke from the Catholic Church. He destroyed a marriage. He changed the religion of an entire nation, just to make Anne Boleyn his wife. This was a woman of extraordinary power, of extraordinary intelligence, of extraordinary strength. And yet, within 3 years of becoming queen, she was gone, accused of crimes historians now believe were almost certainly fabricated, betrayed by those closest to her, and abandoned by the man who had moved heaven and earth to have her. But the deepest betrayal, the one that cuts through history, even 500 years later, was not Henry. It was not her enemies. It was the man who was supposed to love her unconditionally, her father, Thomas Boleyn. Stay with me, because this story will break your heart. To understand the betrayal, you must first understand the woman. Anne Boleyn was born around 1501, into a family that was ambitious, deeply ambitious. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat, a man who understood power, who understood how courts worked, and he had a plan. His daughters would be his greatest weapons. At age 12 or 13, Anne was sent away, first to the Netherlands, to the court of Margaret of Austria, one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, then to France, to serve the French queen, while other girls her age were home with their families, and was learning languages, music, politics, how power really worked. She watched queens. She watched kings. She watched how men treated powerful women. And she took notes. By the time Anne returned to England in 1522, she was not the same girl who had left. She was 21 years old, educated beyond almost any woman in England, confident, sharp, and completely different from every other woman at court. Other women at court were beautiful, quiet, obedient, and was something else entirely. She had opinions. She expressed them. She debated with men. She challenged ideas. At a time when this was almost unheard of. For a woman, she was not considered conventionally beautiful. Historical records describe her as magnetic rather than beautiful, dark eyes that people could not look away from. Together they did something that shook the entire world. Henry broke from the Catholic Church completely. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. 500 years of Catholic authority, gone, in one decision, and historians largely agree that Anne Boleyn was a driving force behind this. She was deeply religious, but in a reformist way. She believed the church had become corrupt, that the Bible should be available in English, so ordinary people could read it, not just priests. She actually gave Henry a copy of William Tyndale's book, The Obedience of a Christian Man, a book that argued kings should be the head of their own churches. She handed him the argument that changed England forever. On the 25th of January 1533, Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII were married, secretly, in a small private ceremony, and on the 1st of June 1533, she was crowned Queen of England. The crowds watched, some cheered, some were silent, because the people still loved Catherine. But Anne was queen now, powerful, influential, at the absolute peak of everything she had worked for, and Thomas Boleyn, her father, was rewarded handsomely. He was made Earl of Wiltshire, Earl of Ormond. He was given land, power, position, everything he had ever wanted, through his daughter. But here is what nobody talks about. Thomas Boleyn did not love Anne the way a father loves a daughter. He loved what Anne could do for him. There is a difference, a devastating difference, because when Anne was rising, Thomas was by her side, smiling, proud, supportive. But what happens when the power starts to fade? What happens when the king grows tired? What happens when a father must choose between his daughter and his own survival? Thomas Boleyn would answer that question in the most devastating way possible. Anne Boleyn was Queen of England, but the clock was ticking, and she did not know it. Henry had moved mountains for her, changed a religion for her, destroyed a marriage for her. But Henry VIII was not a man of loyalty. He was a man of desire, and desire eventually fades. The first sign of trouble came quickly, in September 1533, and gave birth. The entire court held its breath. Henry desperately wanted a son, an heir, a boy who would carry his name, carry his throne. The baby arrived. It was a girl, Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs England would ever know. But in that moment, she was a disappointment to her father. Henry had expected a son, planned for a son, and the look on his face when he heard the news said everything, and saw that look, and she understood. The pressure was now enormous. She needed to give Henry a son. Everything depended on it. In 1534, Anne became pregnant again, but the pregnancy was lost, a miscarriage. Then in 1536, another pregnancy, another loss. Some historians believe this baby may have been a boy. If true, the cruelty of that moment is almost unbearable. With each loss, Henry grew colder, more distant, more dangerous. Anne, who had always been sharp, confident, unafraid, was now desperately trying to hold everything together. Meanwhile, someone else had noticed. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief advisor, one of the most powerful men in England. Cromwell and Anne had worked together once, but now they were enemies, and disagreed with Cromwell over how church money should be used. She believed it should go to education and the poor. Cromwell believed it should go to the king and to men like himself, and was pushing for reform, real reform, and that made her dangerous to Cromwell, to the old powers at court, to everyone who benefited from things staying the same. Cromwell began building a case, quietly, carefully, gathering whispers. Before the trial even began, and sitting on that jury, was a face Anne recognized, a face she had known her entire life, her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and somewhere in that room, connected to those proceedings, was her father, Thomas Boleyn, the man who had sent her to Europe, to be educated, to be polished, to be positioned, as his greatest asset. Thomas Boleyn had already sat on the jury that convicted her brother George, his own son. He had looked at George and voted guilty, sealing his son's death, and in doing so, sealing Anne's fate too, because under Tudor law, if George was guilty of the charges against him, Anne's guilt was almost certain to follow. Thomas Boleyn made that choice, consciously, deliberately. Some historians argue he had no choice, that refusing would have meant his own death. Perhaps, but here is what we know for certain. He did not fight for his children. He did not refuse to participate. He did not stand up and say these charges are false. He sat down, and he voted, and his vote helped kill his daughter. The verdict came quickly, guilty, on all charges, and Boleyn, Queen of England, found guilty of crimes she almost certainly never committed. She was told she would die. She looked at her judges, at the men who had condemned her, and she said something remarkable. She said she believed that those who had judged her would face a higher judgment, one they could not escape. Then she was taken back to her cell, to wait for the end. And Thomas Boleyn, her father, walked out of that room, a free man, his title intact, his lands intact, his life intact. He had survived by sacrificing everything that should have mattered most. The morning of the 19th of May, 1536, arrived cold and quiet, and Boleyn woke in the Tower of London. Knowing this was her last day, she dressed carefully, a dark gray gown, a red petticoat beneath. Some say the red was deliberate, a final act of defiance, a final statement, collecting rumors, looking for anything he could use against her. And in April 1536, he found his moment. A musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested. Historians believe he was tortured. Under that pressure, he confessed to adultery with the Queen. It was almost certainly false, but it was enough. More arrests followed. 5 men in total, including Anne's own brother George, accused of the most unthinkable crime, incest, with his own sister. There was no evidence. None. But evidence was not really the point. On the 2nd of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same tower where she had stayed the night before her coronation, 3 years earlier, full of hope, full of power, full of everything. And now, she was its prisoner. And Boleyn was in the tower, waiting for her trial, waiting for someone to save her. But no one came, not her friends, not her allies, not the man who had moved mountains for her, and not the man who was supposed to love her most. The trial was set for the 15th of May, 1536. 2,000 spectators gathered to watch a queen be judged. The charges were read aloud. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. Conspiracy against the king. Charges so serious that they carried only one sentence, death, and stood before the court, calm, composed, extraordinary. Eyewitnesses described her as more magnificent in her composure than she had ever been as queen. She denied every charge, every single one, clearly, firmly, without hesitation, and modern historians agree with her. The evidence was almost non-existent. The confessions were almost certainly forced. The charges were almost certainly fabricated by Cromwell to remove a queen who had become inconvenient to a king who had already moved on. Henry was already in love with Jane Seymour. While Anne sat in the tower, he was planning his next wedding. But none of that mattered now, because the jury had already decided. She did not accuse Henry. She did not name Cromwell. She did not condemn her father. She simply said that she prayed for the king, that she submitted herself to the law of the land, and that she hoped God would save the king and send him long to reign over them. Even now, even at the very end, she was extraordinary. The French swordsman raised his blade, and in one swift moment, it was over, and Boleyn, Queen of England, was gone. She was 35 years old. Across the city, Henry VIII was waiting, on Tower Hill, for the cannon fire that would signal her death. When he heard it, he turned his horse and rode to Hampton Court to play tennis. The next day, he announced his engagement to Jane Seymour. 11 days later, they were married, and Thomas Boleyn, her father, the man who had built his entire career on his daughter's rise, the man who had sat on the jury that condemned his own children. What happened to him? He lost his positions at court. He lost much of his influence. He retreated to his estates, and he lived, for 3 more years, in relative quiet. He died in 1539, 3 years after Anne. History does not record whether he felt guilt, whether he grieved, whether in his final years he thought about the daughter he had sacrificed. We will never know. But here is what we do know. Anne Boleyn was innocent. Modern historians are almost unanimous. The charges were fabricated. The trial was a performance. The verdict was decided before she ever walked into that room. She was killed because a king had grown tired of her, because a powerful advisor felt threatened by her, and because the men around her chose their own survival over her life, including her own father. But here is the extraordinary thing. Anne Boleyn lost everything: her freedom, her crown, her life, and yet she won. The daughter they dismissed that September morning in 1533 because she was not a boy. That girl, Elizabeth, grew up to become Elizabeth I, Queen of England, for 45 years, one of the greatest monarchs in the history of the world. And Boleyn's bloodline sat on the throne of England for nearly half a century. The religion she helped create still exists today. The reforms she fought for changed England forever. They tried to erase her. They failed. 500 years later, we still say her name. We still tell her story. Because some people are too powerful to silence, even in death. If the story moved you, subscribe to Empire of Shadows. Because history is full of women like Anne. Women who were brilliant, who were powerful, who were betrayed, and who deserve to be remembered. This was Empire of Shadows, and we will see you in the next story.